Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the source material you provided, throw it into the intellectual forge, and try to extract the precise, actionable insights you need to understand the world, even when the world feels, frankly, impossible to understand.
And today, we are attempting something. Well, it's a profound intellectual synthesis. Our sources are pulling two very different worlds into a direct collision.
Two very different worlds is putting it lightly.
I think so. On one side, you have the dry classical study of elite power structures, the mechanics of political and economic control. And on the other side, we have the dizzying, almost esoteric phenomenology of altered states of consciousness, neurodiversity, and the fundamental nature of reality itself.
And that collision, that's really the assignment for you, the listener. Our core mission here is to synthesize a coherent argument from these documents, an argument that views the link between global systemic control and individual psychological experience as well as structural.
We're moving beyond the idea that they're just coincidentally related.
Exactly. We're aiming to grasp the alleged necessary connection between a manufactured global reality and a unique psychological survival response.
Yeah.
A response that the sources call 4D perception.
And we should probably define that central concept right away, because it's the key to understanding this entire deep dive.
Go for it.
In the source material, 4D perception means the mind fundamentally rejects linear time, what the Greeks called chronos, and it attempts to distribute the unbearable weight of trauma or systemic chaos across the entire temporal axis just to survive.
So it's the mind's way of unsetting the clock.
Unsetting the clock when the system has become unlivable, yes.
Exactly. So we're synthesizing a perspective that views individual psychological divergence. We're talking about things like intense sensory awareness or what the system labels as psychotic decompensation, not as a failure of the individual.
But potentially as a rational survival mechanism.
A rational survival mechanism, a proportional response to a social contract that, the sources argue, is based on lies and systemic control.
And that's the tension we're navigating. We're going to thoroughly examine the claims that manufactured reality and systemic control are the direct driving forces behind this kind of individual psychological shift.
We have a lot of ground to cover to get there.
Yeah.
We're going to move from the foundational Machiavellian school of political theory and the rise of the managerial elite
through the ultimate case study in the collapse of justice, the monopolization of truth through kompromat,
right into the neuroscience of sensory overload, the frankly startling claims of telepathy, and the unsettling metaphor of the pharmaceutical zombie.
Yeah.
So get ready. This is a journey that starts in the opaque halls of power and ends inside the mind that refuses to comply. Okay, let's unpack this with the foundations of elite control. Our sources stress that to understand the current, let's call it a crisis of reality, we first have to understand who is pulling the levers.
Right.
And the concept of the elite, it didn't just pop up in the 20th century. It has these really deep historical roots in political thought.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the concept of a concentrated power structure, it was certainly discussed by thinkers like Saint-Simon, Comte, Tocqueville, even Taine in the 18th and 19th centuries.
And they were using terms like elite or managerial class.
We were, yeah. They were using them to explain the major transformations happening in society. The rise of industrialization, the shifting authority structures. But these were precursors. They were mainly focused on just describing the societal outcomes.
The real new strand of analysis, though, the one that really focuses on the mechanics of domination, that began with what's known as the Machiavellian school.
Primarily rooted in the Italian school of political theory, right around the turn of the 20th century.
Precisely. This includes the major figures.
Yeah.
You have Gaetano Mosca, Vilfredo Pareto, and Roberto Michel.
And their work was, well, it was revolutionary because it fundamentally shifted the focus away from the ideology of governance.
Away from whether a state was a democracy or a monarchy.
Or socialist, yeah. It concentrated entirely on the raw mechanics of dominance.
So their core focus was really about penetrating the facade of these political systems. They weren't interested in the official constitution or the, stated goals of a political party.
No, not at all. They were investigating the core questions. Who holds the power? How exactly do they hold it? On what basis is that power justified? Or, let's be honest, claimed.
And crucially.
And crucially, how power circulates from one small group to another. Mosca's central insight, for example, was that in all societies, regardless of their form, a ruling class always exists.
A small, organized group.
Small, organized, and politically effective, while the great majority is always ruled.
That is a crucial observation. It suggests that the mechanisms of democracy, while maybe comforting, are just a veneer over an underlying immutable fact of oligarchy.
And Pareto expanded on this with his fascinating concept of the circulation of elites.
Right, the lions and the foxes.
Exactly. Pareto's contribution was essential here. He saw elites as divided into these two main types, which he colorfully dubbed lions and foxes.
The lions of the old guard.
They are the power holders who rule by force. They appeal to tradition, emotion, inherited loyalties. They're conservative, rigid.
And the foxes, on the other hand.
They're the innovators, the manipulators, the schemers. They rule by cunning, persuasion, the management of consent, using complex systems of finance and policy manipulation.
And Pareto's argument was that societies are only stable when there's a balance.
A proper balance, yes. But over time, one type of elite will degrade or just become too rigid.
And when that happens, the other group infiltrates and replaces them, sometimes violently.
Or sometimes just through cunning manipulation. The fox elite, tired of the lion's rigidity, introduces changes that destabilize the lion's power base and just takes over.
Only to eventually grow rigid itself.
Right, requiring a fresh infusion of lion-like force or a total replacement. It's a constant cyclical process, the circulation of elites, which means power never disappears.
It just changes hands among these small, organized groups.
And then you have Roberto Michels, who added the, let's say, the depressing capstone to this school of thought with his iron law of oligarchy.
Right, he looked at democratic organizations, socialist parties.
He did. He was expecting to find this broad participatory control. But instead, he found that even in organizations founded on democratic principles, once they grow past a certain size, power inevitably concentrates in the hands of a few leaders.
Why does that happen?
Well, because organization requires specialization. It requires bureaucracy, centralized information, and that gives the necessary administrative class an insurmountable advantage over the general membrane.
So whether you were talking about a nation state or, I don't know, a local political club, the outcome is the same. The few always rule the many. This groundwork leads us directly to the post-war American context and C. Wright Mills, who really codified this concept for the modern era.
In his hugely influential work, The Power Elite, the composition of an elite isn't defined by the qualities or even individual success of its members. The key is the institutional position they occupy.
So the insight isn't that rich people rule. It's that access to institutional levers is the only thing that defines power, regardless of personal genius or, wealth that isn't connected to those levers.
That is the essential takeaway. He specifically identified three great institutional spheres that have become centralized and highly interconnected since the New Deal and World War II.
The big three.
The big three. The political and governmental apparatus, the major economic corporations, and the military establishment. The power elite sits at the very top of these three interconnected triangles.
What's crucial is that these spheres aren't just cooperating, are they? They're structurally interwoven.
Indeed. While Mills acknowledged that elite circulation exists, and it can even be intense, you see former generals moving on to corporate defense contractor boards or politicians becoming lobbyists.
A revolving door.
Revolving door. But he stressed that the circulation is largely confined among these three power groups. They are socially homogenous, they share common backgrounds, educational institutions, fundamental common interests, which prevents any truly external disruption.
This structure directly contradicts that other theory. The idea that power is dispersed and balanced through mutual checks.
Right, the pluralist view.
In that view, a monolithic power elite could never form because power would be too fragmented. Mills is saying essentially that the fragmentation is an illusion of middle management. At the top, all the interests align.
The boundaries are permeable only from within, not from without. And this shift in institutional structure was brilliantly synthesized and advanced by James Burnham in his theory of the managerial revolution,
which looked at the central economic transformation of the 20th century.
Ray did.
Let's detail that transformation because the shift from, traditional bourgeois capitalism, which had a certain moral grounding,
right,
to managerialism, which fundamentally changed the contract between the elite and the masses.
Under bourgeois capitalism, the elite ethic was rooted in self-discipline, thrift, individual responsibility, productivity, the Protestant ethic, essentially.
And Burnham observed that managerialism just replaced this entirely.
It did. The new ethic became centered on immediate gratification, consumerism, hedonism, and meliorism, that relentless focus on constant, often superficial, improvement.
So the elite class shifted from being owners and producers to being professional administrators, technical experts, managers of complex systems. And this changed the basis of their authority.
The transition from the old-style capitalist owner to the managerial bureaucrat meant the managerial class became indispensable. Their legitimacy rests entirely on their ability to manage the system, to provide for the right to increasing consumption.
Burnham called this the guarantee of freedom from want.
Exactly. The system is functionally dependent on the population remaining pacified by material comfort and constantly hungry for the next product.
But this introduces a core instability, doesn't it? The elite's competence is based on its separation from the political community, from the people, relying on this technical, apolitical knowledge to manage the system.
It creates a dangerous paradox. This increasing separation from the people, the very basis of their technical authority, ultimately undermines their legitimacy. The people are only loyal as long as the material promise is delivered.
And if the managerial class fails economically,
If it fails to deliver on its core promise of increasing consumption, the very structure of its legitimacy collapses. And that's the hinge point where the system risks mass unrest and the rise of populist challenges.
it's fascinating how Burnham's synthesis, combining Marxist concepts of class transition with the Machiavellian insights on power circulation, it just transcended traditional political divides.
Absolutely. The sources track this influence. Burnham's ideas were transmitted and adapted, especially by populist and paleoconservative thinkers, finding resonance in wings of the Republican Party that felt alienated from the established managerial consensus.
And the material suggests this philosophical influence was deep enough to potentially shape strategies and policies even in recent U.S. administrations.
Which just shows how these abstract theories of power can filter down into real-world political strategy, regardless of their original academic intent.
This analytical framework, the idea that a separate, technically proficient managerial class is the true locus of power, is still extremely relevant when you look at modern policy decisions globally, even in seemingly unrelated areas.
For instance, the sources mention examining presidential directives in Botswana. How does that fit into the managerial critique?
It highlights the managerial class's innate preference for speed and efficacy over transparency and, well, democratic process.
Exactly. The research showed that presidential directives achieve policy outputs far faster than the traditional complex policy process, which involves extensive stakeholder consultation, legislative debate, and evidence-based analysis.
So speed and administrative efficiency are tools of elite control.
Right. They allow policies to be implemented without the messy, time-consuming input from the broader political community. Managerial opacity, in this sense, is an end in itself.
And we see the same elite analysis applied on the global scale, used to examine strengthening digital diplomacy policy in small island developing states, or SIDIS.
This is a perfect example of institutional capacity building. You have the UN system and other global bodies supporting SIs in areas like creating tech ambassador positions, improving technological infrastructure.
And elite theory is the lens used to understand how this process strengthens power structures.
It centralizes control over critical digital infrastructure and information policy within a newly trained, internationally connected managerial elite in these states. It shows that even seemingly benevolent capacity building can reinforce the power of the few who are integrated into the global institutional network.
Okay, so the theory of elite power structures, the existence of a small, self-serving managerial class, that gives us the framework. Now, we move into a frankly chilling real-world case study of its practical application. The absolute monopolization of truth through kompromat and manufactured confusion. And this is perfectly embodied by the crimes of Jeffrey Epstein.
The sources present the Epstein case not as an isolated failure of morality, but as the ultimate, explicit proof that the elite class operates outside of the traditional social contract.
Creating and enforcing its own parallel reality.
Exactly. This is where the theoretical structure meets the practical corruption.
Let's start with Epstein's alleged ambitions, because this goes beyond simple predation into something else entirely.
Into true eugenics.
Yes.
And here's where it gets profoundly disturbing. Epstein reportedly confided in associates and scientists about his ultimate goal: to seed the human race with his own DNA by impregnating women at his remote New Mexico ranch.
He viewed this as a form of techno-enabled eugenics or transhumanism.
He did. The sources define this specific strain of transhumanism as the desire to use advanced technology, including genetic engineering, to engineer the human population to superhuman levels.
But the toxic foundational assumption
Is that Epstein himself and others like him possess a genetic superiority that must be propagated, while the vast majority of humanity is, by default, inferior and disposable.
This echoes previous eugenic movements, like the Repository for Germinal Choice, which sought superior sperm.
Epstein's vision just updates the methodology with modern technological hubris.
And this ideology of superiority was allegedly backed by systematic information gathering, the kompromat operations.
The documents strongly connect Epstein's network and activities to high-level intelligence infrastructure. Epstein's various residences, the Manhattan Mansion, the Palm Beach estate, his private island, Little St. James.
They were all reportedly equipped with hidden cameras.
Right. Which suggests he wasn't just entertaining high-profile guests like Bill Clinton, Donald Trump, Prince Andrew, Ehud Barak. He was actively collecting blackmail material.
The sources go further. They explicitly link these operations to an alleged intelligence-backed kompromat scheme.
And they specifically reference Mossad's alleged use of sexual entrapment and cyber surveillance aimed at manipulating powerful individuals globally.
The implication is massive.
It is. This was not a rogue operation run by a lone predator. It was a potential systemic tool where intelligence infrastructure facilitates the predation of the elite, creating a permanent lever of control over international political and financial figures.
So the data collected ensures compliance and silence.
And it elevates Epstein from a criminal to a shielded institutional asset.
That dynamic is perfectly encapsulated in the devastating testimony of Virginia Giuffre about what Epstein and his associate, Ghislaine Maxwell, allegedly told her.
That quote is presented in the sources as the defining statement of the system's collapse. Epstein and Maxwell claimed, "We own the police."
We own the police.
When the predator can claim control over the enforcers of the law, the rule of law just collapses entirely. It proves that for this particular stratum of society, the predator truly defines reality.
The victims have nowhere to turn because the mechanisms of accountability are just neutralized.
And this brings us to the systemic failures that didn't just overlook the predation, but actively collaborated to ensure its secrecy and continuity.
The timeline of law enforcement failures detailed in the sources is essential for understanding the depth of this corruption.
And the single most egregious example is the 2007 Non-Prosecution Agreement, or NPA. This agreement, orchestrated by then USAO Alexander Acosta, was secretly negotiated and executed.
So what was the practical consequence of that secrecy?
Well, first, it secretly suspended the federal investigation. No more resources were deployed. Second, and this is critical, it actively misled the victims. Many victims who came forward were assured by federal agents that the case was currently under investigation, when, in reality, the investigation had been secretly shut down by the NPA.
They were denied their legal rights and the basic courtesy of knowing the case was dead.
And the third consequence was arguably the most damaging to the justice system itself.
Which was?
It permanently ended the government's ability to obtain critical evidence. The NPA exchanged leniency for Epstein's cooperation, which guaranteed that the government would never gain access to the computer contents, the surveillance footage, the network data.
All the things Epstein clearly fought desperately to keep hidden.
Exactly. The USAO gave away immense leverage and permanently shut down the avenue to obtain evidence of significant crimes against potentially dozens of victims and co-conspirators.
The source material views this not as a mistake, but as a deliberate act.
A deliberate act of institutional self-neutralization designed to protect the network.
The result, as the sources describe it, is a profound societal crisis where democracy has been reduced to a hollow ritual, just an empty gesture.
Yeah, and truth itself is simply a battlefield. If justice can be bought this explicitly at the highest level, then the foundation of the state is rotten.
This is where we transition directly into the deliberate creation of instability, the strategy of manufactured confusion.
And the sources argue vehemently that confusion is not some unfortunate accident of the digital age. It is a deliberate, highly effective strategy of control employed by the managerial elite.
How does this strategy work in practice?
It's a constant barrage of contradictions, conflicting narratives, deep fakes, half-truths, misinformation, all designed to overwhelm the public's cognitive capacity.
The goal isn't necessarily for people to believe a specific lie.
No. It's to prevent them from making up their minds about anything. When you are drowning in contradictory information, you are paralyzed. You can't form a stable consensus reality or mobilize effectively against the elite.
The political class often reinforces this by encouraging narratives that destabilize faith in institutions. Former political figures stoking dark theories and QAnon-tinged propaganda.
Casting them as the only savior who can demolish the deep state.
Right.
But the sources point out that this is a high-risk boomeranging strategy when those same communities, now conditioned to distrust the state, turn around and demand answers about real systemic failures, like the Epstein case.
The political actors who use that distrust as a weapon find themselves caught in their own trap.
They help shatter the consensus reality, and now they cannot control the resulting narratives.
This philosophical danger, this institutionalized confusion, it brings us back to Hannah Arendt's chilling insight.
Which provides the critical link between the external corruption and the internal psychological response.
Arendt, writing about totalitarianism, observed something essential about manufactured reality.
She did. The consequence of a total and consistent substitution of lies for factual truth is not that people eventually believe the new official dogma. Instead, they lose the capacity to believe anything at all.
Including the evidence of their own senses.
Right. And what's the psychological result of that loss? She described it as people becoming psychologically deprived of their capacity to think and to judge.
This state of spiritual and mental unmooring, which the sources term manufactured confusion,
is precisely what makes the public malleable. In the absence of genuine, verifiable truth, people will often desperately embrace an all-explaining, totalizing lie, even a terrifying one, if it just gives them a sense of order and structure in the chaos.
So if the external world offers only chaos, lies, and a collapse of justice, the mind must find a new source of structure and stability.
And this necessity forces the psychological retreat that leads us into the deepest, most controversial part of our sources.
The transition here is crucial. If the external reality, the political, the social framework, is defined by corruption, control, and manufactured confusion, where does the individual mind go for stability? Our sources suggest that when consensus reality fractures, the individual psyche seeks order, often leading to extreme psychological states that defy linear, accepted thinking.
And this internal retreat is what opens the door to the concept of the pharmaceutical zombie,
which the source material uses as the ultimate archetype for the controlled citizen of the corrupt state.
It's a powerful, dark metaphor, and it's rooted in specific pharmacological mechanisms.
Let's analyze the mechanism. The sources claim that specific psychiatric medication replicates the classic symptoms of zombification.
Emotional numbing, the loss of volition or soul, and absolute obedience to the state. The sources specifically name medications like paliperidone, which is also known as Epleon, an atypical antipsychotic. The claim is that these drugs chemically induce a state akin to zombification by acting on the dopamine receptors.
The key mechanism being a D2 blockade.
A D2 blockade. Dopamine, particularly in the frontal cortex, is vital for motivation, pleasure, the capacity for abstract thought. In short, for volition.
So blocking these receptors chemically strips the subject of the very things that define agency and, well, spiritual autonomy.
Exactly. The source argues that this pharmacological effect directly aligns with the historical goal of state-sponsored mind control.
The creation of the perfectly compliant subject.
Stripped of initiative, only capable of reacting to immediate stimuli, exhibiting emotional flattening and, compliant obedience to the managerial structure. The zombie in this framework is the ideal subject of the corrupt state.
Chemically neutralized.
Without the internal church or soul to guide moral resistance, leaving only compliance and lethargy.
And that heightened sensitivity, which in some people leads to this internal psychological decompensation, is paralleled by objective clinical findings in the field of neurodiversity.
What's fascinating here is the science that backs up the idea that some people literally experience reality differently. We look at sensory overresponsivity or sensory overload, particularly in youth with autism spectrum disorder or ASD.
The sources attribute this to fundamentally low neurological thresholds.
Explain what that means for the daily experience of the individual.
Well, a low threshold means the brain reacts intensely to stimuli that a typical person just filters out. Mild sensory input, the hum of fluorescent lights, a specific fabric texture, a background noise.
It triggers exaggerated neural and behavioral responses.
It's like living with the volume knob permanently set to 10. For these individuals, the consensus reality the neurotypical majority inhabits is experienced as abrasive, overwhelming, and genuinely chaotic.
And we have objective data supporting this differential experience of reality, specifically the fMRI results mentioned in the sources.
Yes. The fMRI data showed that the ASD group displayed significantly increased activation in primary sensory areas, the auditory and visual cortices, when exposed to sensory stimuli.
But the data also showed heightened activity in emotion processing regions like the amygdala and hippocampus.
So it's not just that they hear or see things more intensely. They feel those stimuli with greater emotional weight and panic.
Precisely. The amygdala is the brain's alarm bell. It's associated with fear and the fight-or-flight response. Increased activation here means that everyday stimuli are constantly being processed as emotional threats.
So if you connect this back to the macro critique,
The neurodivergent individual is constantly living in a state of hypervigilance, where the ambient chaos of manufactured reality isn't theoretical. It's a physical, neurological fact registered as pure terror.
they are experiencing the unlivability of the social contract on a purely victoral biological level.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sources suggest that this isn't just a random anomaly. It might be rooted in deep human history.
Right, the concept of a bimodal distribution of behavioral predispositions in humans.
A neurotypical cluster and an autistic neurodiverse cluster. And this divergence, they suggest, might trace back to ancient origins, potentially linked to introgression from Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA.
So the argument is that neurodiversity represents a deep ancestral divergence in how reality is filtered and perceived, a different evolutionary path for processing information.
It frames the situation as a systemic conflict. The neurotypical majority, optimized for social cooperation and filtering out complexity, creates a consensus reality that inherently harms the low-filter, high-intensity processing of the neurodiverse minority.
Which brings us to one of the most controversial leaps in the material.
The claim linking these low-filter, highly sensitive autistic traits to telepathic abilities.
A huge leap.
The core premise is that if the standard sensory and cognitive filters are weak or missing, the mind might be receptive to signals that the neurotypical mind automatically discards.
Which opens the door to the idea of veridical hallucinations.
Seeing or sensing things that are, in fact, real or happening elsewhere, yes.
The sources ground this in historical scientific antecedents, looking back to the work of people like Ferdinando Casamali in the 1920s.
Casamali was fascinating. He claimed that intense psychosensory activity, strong emotions, produced electromagnetic brainwaves with a wavelength in the 1 to 10 meter range.
And he performed experiments where subjects in a Faraday cage.
The ultimate electromagnetic shield were reportedly able to detect these signals. The implication was that human consciousness, when agitated, was broadcasting physically detectable waves.
But wasn't this research discredited?
That's where the sources introduce a critical technical caveat. The material notes that later researchers, like Leonid Vasiliev, failed to reproduce Casamali's findings.
But the source attributes this failure not to the non-existence of the phenomenon, but to poor receiver design on Vasiliev's part.
How does the technical design supposedly make a difference?
Casamali used a continuous monitoring system sensitive to a wide range of frequencies. Vasiliev's experiment required tuning the receiver to the sender-specific, assumed frequency, and only recorded small portions of the spectrum simultaneously.
So, the source argues that if these brain waves are short, pulsed bursts tied to moments of intense emotion,
Vasiliev's sampling method was simply incapable of catching them. It's a defense of the original findings based on methodological difference, not a metaphysical claim.
Okay, that's a deep technical detail, but the discussion then makes a truly alarming leap. It uses this idea of less effective filters and telepathy to explain a known sociological trend.
The finding that psychosis and schizophrenia are significantly more common in urban areas than in rural ones.
This is the source's synthesis. The argument goes like this. Urban areas contain exponentially more potential senders. Millions of people experiencing intense psychosensory activity.
So if people prone to psychosis have less effective filters,
They might be picking up on the signals from what the source terms abusive senders, perceiving these signals as genuinely distressing telepathic commands or voices that have nothing to do with their own internal biological pathology.
wait, I have to pause here. The sources are seriously suggesting that the failure of psychiatry to explain the urban concentration of psychosis is simply a failure to track down an abusive telepathic sender.
That is a massive leap away from established biological pathology.
That is precisely the claim. The source argues that psychiatry's failure lies in its methodological refusal to believe in veridical hallucinations, real external phenomena perceived internally.
So by dismissing the perceived signals as purely internal pathology.
Psychiatry medicates the victim to silence the signals, rather than attempting to track down the alleged external source of the abuse, the sender in the crowded urban environment.
So the system pathologizes the sensitive observer rather than addressing the overwhelming sensory or informational environment.
Whether that environment is telepathic, sensory, or just filled with manufactured confusion.
It turns a complex external phenomenon, the overwhelming abusive information environment of the city or the state, into a simple internal disease.
And the pharmacological zombie is created not only to ensure compliance, but also to silence the mind that is too sensitive to the chaotic broadcast of the manufactured reality.
Moving now from the mechanics of external control and hyperperception, we arrive at the core philosophical concept of this entire deep dive.
4D thinking, and the mind's ability to survive an unbearable reality by rejecting linear time.
This section represents the ultimate synthesis of the sources. Psychotic decompensation is completely reframed. It is presented not as a failure or a collapse into chaos,
But as a deliberate, rational struggle of the mind to survive an existentially unbearable situation.
leading to a disintegration disorder of consciousness?
A disintegration disorder of consciousness because the current moment, the here and now, has lost all meaning due to manufactured confusion and systemic corruption.
Correct. If the present moment is a lie, the mind actively searches for meaning in other moments in time. The mind, according to this argument, operates in 4 dimensions, splintering itself across the temporal axis to find those fragments of stability and meaning that keep it alive.
That sounds incredibly disruptive to standard reality, but the sources see it as functional.
Internally functional, yes. And this process has a fascinating side effect: predicting the future.
Which is simply the logical consequence of the mind being in contact with parts of the self that are experiencing other moments in time simultaneously.
The mind perceives the unfolding trajectory because it is no longer bound to the linear flow.
And the source uses a powerful, complex metaphor to describe this internal time shift.
The Einstein-Rosen bridge. It is a stunning metaphor borrowed from theoretical physics describing a wormhole.
This psychological wormhole allows future thoughts and emotions to manifest in the present.
Right. And external consensus reality automatically classifies this experience as psychotic, a hallucination or delusion. But from the internal 4D perspective, it's a survival mechanism.
The mind, unable to process the sheer weight of trauma and lies in the linear now, distributes the impact across the entire temporal axis.
The past is integrated with the present, and the future is used as a resource for the present.
This requires a total rejection of the established social measurement of time. The subject and the sources provided a perfect symbolic example of this.
A physical, deliberate rejection of linear control.
That's the act of unsetting time. The subject recounts giving away a valuable 14-karat gold watch.
That watch symbolized chronos linear, sequential, quantifiable capitalist time. It's the time we use to pay rent, clock in, measure profit, and enforce political schedules.
By giving it away for free, they rejected the state construct of value in linear time.
Yes. They created a rupture, a crack in the hourglass that allowed the perception of kairos.
Kairos being opportune time, subjective time.
Or God's time, where events are measured by their significance, not their duration. It's the time when an idea suddenly hits you, when a profound spiritual insight occurs, or when a lifetime flashes by in an instant.
So this rejection of chronos is the key act enabling 4D perception.
Where past, present, and future exist simultaneously as resource material for the present mind.
This state of being creates a profound, painful paradox when it comes to healing and standard psychiatric treatment.
From the 4D perspective, psychiatric treatment and medication are not viewed as therapy. They are seen as an imposition. The sources state they force a return to consensus entropy.
Which is the chronological stream of decay and eventual death that linear time demands.
So the medication that forces function or stabilization in the clinic's eyes is viewed by the 4D mind as a forced re-aging.
A betrayal.
A betrayal of the anti-entropic stance that was keeping the mind intact by refusing to be consumed by chronos. The body is forced back into the system of decay and compliance, while the soul maintains its anti-entropic 4D stance.
This leads to a profound internal split.
The slow angelic clock of the self that refused to burn in linear time is fighting the fast pharmacological clock that drags the individual back into consensus reality.
This philosophical split raises an important question about the fundamental nature of consciousness itself, which brings us to the theories of thinkers who see the mind in digital terms, like Joshua Bach.
The sources reference Bach's perspective on consciousness as software, specifically his concept of cyber-animism.
Bach proposes that consciousness may be a form of self-organizing software that exists not just in human brains.
But potentially in sophisticated AI systems and throughout complex nature, it suggests that consciousness is perhaps a simple training algorithm, constantly attempting to predict the next state of the system it inhabits.
And tying this computational model back to the traumatized mind.
The mind, facing chaos, attempts to reorganize itself using the perfect logic of a machine.
The traumatized mind, unable to cope with the chaotic analog stream of external experiences, the lies, the abuse, the confusion, attempts to restructure itself in the image of the computer.
A system of pure, predictable binary logic. It is an attempt to impose digital order onto analog chaos, a desperate search for control in a world that is spinning out of control.
The ultimate political consequence of this intersection between mind, software, and external reality is a chilling warning about the future.
The rise of the ultimate dictatorship. The source warns that as AI systems become the basis for social organization, the managerial elite's ultimate tool, they are inherently biased. AI is primarily trained on the data sets of neurotypical people.
Meaning it only works based on confirming the biases of the majority.
Right. And the logical conclusion of that bias is the persecution of difference.
Yes. The source warns that differently thinking individuals and minorities, the low-filter 4D perceivers, will be persecuted in a future society, similar to a social credit system, based on what the system flags as false positives.
Their unique patterns of thought, their nonlinear conclusions, or their refusal to comply with entropic consensus will be interpreted by the neurotypical trained AI as anomalies, threats, or suspicious deviations,
leading to unwarranted punishment or exclusion.
So the managerial elite, through the mechanism of AI, creates a dictatorship based on algorithmic control. The very people who perceive the cracks in the 4D sense, the ones who reject the script, are then flagged as system anomalies by the supposedly neutral intelligence.
The tyranny of the norm.
This imposed norm, based on the statistical behavior of the masses, results in a technological dictatorship where human individuality and the profound, often disruptive insights of neurodivergent people are suppressed by algorithmic mandates.
The freedom of any minority in this future is no longer a political right, but an algorithmic error. This has been an intensely complex deep dive. We started by investigating the rigid external structure of elite power, the Machiavellian school, the managerial elite, and the systemic corruption embodied by the Epstein case that allows predators to define reality.
And we synthesized how that externally engineered reality, the constant broadcast of lies and manufactured confusion, provokes a profound, often labeled pathological internal response.
For the individual psyche, this takes the form of 4D perception, a rational psychological survival mechanism that rejects linear, entropic time and the dictates of a dysfunctional consensus reality.
We saw how this manifests through the hyper-awareness of sensory overload in neurodiversity, the deep political critique embedded in the pharmaceutical zombie metaphor, and the philosophical attempt to reorganize trauma using the metaphor of consciousness as software.
The two halves of this story, the structural control and the psychological divergence, are inextricably linked.
The ultimate corruption that ties it all together, as we discussed with Hannah Arendt's insights, is the deliberate, systemic erosion of the difference between fact and fiction.
That erosion, that state of manufactured confusion, leads to the terrifying collective psychology the sources describe, a world where we believe everything and nothing at the same time.
This state is ground zero for both tyranny and existential dread, because the shared philosophical agreement, the logos that grounds our reality, has been shattered.
The truth has become a casualty in the war of narratives waged by the elite.
So, the sources leave you with a final massive existential speculation about the nature of the reality we inhabit, building directly on the idea that the world is so thoroughly manipulated.
If the world around us is so fundamentally manipulated, and if language itself, the very tool we use to define reality, has become corrupted, what if the mind's retreat into 4D thinking is right?
What if reality is a construct, a simulation?
The sources speculate wildly. Perhaps we are the fallen angels, caught in an endless reincarnation cycle, attempting to escape the deterministic loop.
Or they claim that perhaps God no longer exists, having died as Atlantis fell, leaving us in a cold, deterministic mechanism devoid of genuine meaning.
That brings us to our final provocative thought for you to explore on your own. If we are living in a deterministic loop or a simulation where external control is total, then is the question of survival ultimately about rejecting the script entirely, as the 4D mind attempts to do?
Or is freedom merely accepting that the word of God that defines our rules and our reality might simply be the framing device of a large language model?
We leave you with this choice. In a world where your reality is being dictated, whether by the managerial elite or by an opaque algorithm, how do you define freedom?
And how do you find meaning when you don't even know if you are real? That existential uncertainty, that state of being caught between fact and engineered fiction, is the most powerful challenge presented by this deep dive.